2026 Maranello. If you've ever had the honor of stepping through the gates on Via Bet1 Inferior or visiting the Ferrari Museum, you know that specific, almost religious feeling. It's not just another exhibition of expensive cars. It is a true sanctuary of speed. Every red bolide, standing there under perfect lighting, radiates absolute confidence, triumph, and an almost divine majesty. But the history of Ferrari is not just about golden trophies, endless records, and the spray of champagne on the podiums of Monza. It is a deep, sometimes tragic story of how grand pride becomes a fatal weakness, and how a passion meant to give life turns into a destructive fire that consumes everything in its path. We are used to seeing the Scuderia at the summit, crowned with laurels. But in the annals of the prancing horse, there were dark times when the sacred red became the color of shame and public humiliation. These were times when the world's best engineering talents hit a dead end, and the world's fastest drivers looked like helpless children, locked in iron cages of their own incompetence. Today, we will break down the darkest, most painful chapters of the Italian legend, peering into the abyss of 1980, 1992, 2014, and 2020. This is the story of how Ferrari became a victim of its own myth, and why, at certain moments, winning became not just difficult, but physically, technically, and psychologically impossible. To grasp the true scale of the first major catastrophe, we must return to 1979. Back then, Ferrari was the true master of the world. Jody Scheckter became champion, Gilles Villeneuve took second, and the 312 T4 was considered the perfect instrument of victory. The commendator himself, Enzo Ferrari, was at the peak of his power. It seemed the red dictatorship would last forever, but Formula One is a cruel, predatory place where yesterday's brilliant innovations turn into yesterday's trash. Then came 1980, and Ferrari introduced the 312 T5. Visually, it resembled its winning predecessor, but inside, this car was dead on arrival. The entire world of Grand Prix racing was gripped by ground effect fever, a revolutionary concept where air under the car's floor creates a low-pressure zone, literally vacuuming the car to the asphalt. But Ferrari had one massive, monumental problem, and it was called the Flat 12. The legendary 12-cylinder boxer engine, which for years had gifted the team incredible power and reliability, suddenly became their worst curse. It was too wide. Its massive cylinder blocks physically blocked the air channels required to generate downforce. While competitors like Williams and Brabham used narrow V8 engines to create incredible grip, Ferrari was essentially trying to glue a heavy iron brick to the road. The results of that season were not just bad. They were shocking to the entire sporting world. The defending world champion, Jody Scheckter, didn't just fail to defend his title. He suffered a humiliation no champion before him had ever known. He failed to qualify for the Canadian Grand Prix. Imagine a man with the number 1 on his car not making the race because his Ferrari was too slow to even be last on the grid. Gilles Villeneuve, whose talent was considered supernatural, fought for pathetic 10th place finishes, squeezing 110% out of the machinery. But physics was stronger than the driver's will. The Scuderia finished that season in a disgraceful 10th place in the Constructors' Championship, sitting below tiny privateer teams that only historians remember today. This was the moment of truth, a painful collision of Enzo, Ferrari's old-school engineering, which famously claimed aerodynamics are for people who can't build engines, with a new reality. Winning became impossible because the team refused to look into the future, blinded by their own past success. Years passed. Enzo Ferrari departed this world, and a period of great chaos and protracted internal wars began in Maranello. By the early 90s, expectations were sky-high once again. In 1990, Alain Prost had narrowly missed the title, and the team entered 1991 believing in revenge. However, instead of triumph, Ferrari created the 642 and then the 643, cars that were not just slow, but technically unpredictable and dangerous. Alain Prost, nicknamed the Professor for his incredible analytical mind, was in a state of cold fury. His patience finally snapped after the Japanese Grand Prix, where he uttered the phrase that became legendary and simultaneously fatal for his career in red. Driving this car is like driving a heavy truck. It's horrible. For Ferrari, where the cult of the machine and the brand always stood above the driver's personality, this was an unforgivable sacrilege. Prost was fired right before the final race of the season, but this gesture only highlighted the management's helplessness. Firing a legend could not fix the defects of the iron. The following year, 1992, became the true apex of this technical absurdity. The Ferrari F92A was born. Visually, it looked like a work of art, a true spaceship with a unique double-floor concept. Engineers tried to create a forced airflow under the car unlike anything seen before. Theoretically, it was a stroke of genius, but in practice, the car was completely uncontrollable. The airflows under the floor would stall at the slightest turn of the wheel, and the V12 engine was catastrophically heavy and suffered from constant overheating. Drivers Ivan Capelli and Gene Alesi suffered in every session. Capelli later confessed that he was physically afraid to step on the gas because the car behaved like a wounded animal, not knowing where it would throw itself next. It was a year of absolute, thick hopelessness. The team was falling apart. Directors changed almost monthly. Engineers publicly blamed aerodynamicists, and the Italian press held a literal inquisition of the Scuderia every Monday. Ferrari learned a painful lesson. Even with endless money and the best drivers, you cannot win if there is no iron discipline and no single leader. There were too many chefs in Maranello, each with their own recipe, but not a single captain capable of holding the wheel in a storm. After a decade of dominance in the Michael Schumacher era, which seemed eternal, Ferrari slowly began to sink back into a crisis that peaked with the arrival of the hybrid era in 2014. It was a time when the rules of the game changed radically, and Ferrari was once again unprepared for the intellectual duel. The F14T, with its strange nose resembling a vacuum cleaner, became a symbol of technical decline. The Ferrari engine was heavy, weak, and consumed too much fuel compared to the perfect Mercedes power units. Fernando Alonso, one of the greatest drivers in history, performed miracles all season, dragging this red infirmity to positions it didn't deserve. Watching Alonso try to fight the leaders was physically painful. It was a battle of the man against the laws of physics and failed engineering. It was then that Alonso realized his dream of a title with Ferrari had turned into an endless cycle of disappointment. Winning became impossible because the team completely failed to transition to new technologies, stuck in the illusion of their own invulnerability. But the true modern humiliation lay ahead in 2020. It was a catastrophe that even the biggest pessimist could not have imagined. In 2019, Ferrari had the fastest engine on the straights, which raised serious suspicions among competitors. Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel dominated high-speed tracks. But after the FIA conducted an investigation and reached a secret settlement with the team, Ferrari's power suddenly vanished. The 2020 car, the SF1000, named to honor the team's 1000th Grand Prix, turned out to be the slowest Ferrari in decades. At preseason testing in Barcelona, the faces of the mechanics and engineers were whiter than paper. They realized they had built a disaster. When the season began, Ferrari found itself at the back of the midfield. At the legendary Spa-Francorchamps circuit, where red cars were always the kings of speed, Leclerc and Vettel qualified in a humiliating 13th and 14th place. They were effortlessly overtaken by teams with budgets several times smaller. Sebastian Vettel, the legendary four-time champion, looked completely broken, a shadow of his former self. It was a year of public torture under the gaze of millions. Due to development restrictions during the pandemic, Ferrari was forced to finish the season in a car they hated. Every weekend became a funeral of ambitions. Winning was physically impossible because the car was designed for an engine that was essentially castrated right before the start of the season. If we analyze all these tragic years, we can find a clear pattern, an anatomy of failure for Ferrari. The fact is, Ferrari is not just a sports team. It is a national institution of Italy, a state symbol like the flag or the anthem. And that is exactly where their greatest curse lies. The first factor is always the culture of blame. In teams like Red Bull or Mercedes, when a problem arises, all energy goes into finding a technical solution. At Ferrari, the first thing they do is look for someone to blame, to publicly fire them and appease the furious public. This creates an atmosphere of fear where engineers are afraid to take risks, choosing safe, but ultimately losing concepts. The second factor is incredible political pressure. No other team is under such a microscope from the press. Gazzetta dello Sport can change the fate of a chief engineer with a single headline, and management often makes panicked, emotional decisions instead of cold analysis. The third factor is a fatal obsession with tradition. Being Ferrari sometimes becomes more important than being the fastest. They believe in the magic of their name for too long, forgetting that the stopwatch doesn't care about your glorious history or the color of your car. However, even in these darkest times, there is something majestic. Only Ferrari can fall so low and yet cause such an incredible resonance in the world. When any other team loses, it's just a statistic. When Ferrari loses, it is a global tragedy that touches millions of hearts. But history has taught us that Ferrari is a true phoenix. Every time they burned to ashes in the flames of their own mistakes, they found the strength to be reborn. After the disgrace of 1980, they created Turbo Monsters and won Constructors' Cups. After the chaos of the 90s, Jean Todt and Michael Schumacher built the most powerful empire this sport has ever seen. After the humiliation of 2020, they managed to return to the fight for victories. Each cycle of purification through fire leaves deep scars on the hearts of the Tifosi, but it also tempers the team, forcing it to remember its true identity. Today, in 2026, as we stand on the threshold of a new era and Lewis Hamilton puts on a red suit, we have no right to forget these darkest pages. They are an integral part of a legend. Looking at Charles Leclerc leading the team forward, we remember the hell of helplessness he had to endure just a few years ago. Ferrari taught us that victory is not a birthright, but a fragile gift that must be protected every day. Winning became impossible. These words once sounded like a final sentence, but for Ferrari, they were only the most difficult test of strength. They proved they could be their own worst enemies, creating obstacles where there were none, but they also proved that no one in the world knows how to return from oblivion as spectacularly and beautifully as they do. The story of the prancing horse is an eternal reminder to us all. It doesn't matter how loud your name is, it doesn't matter how many billions are in your account. If you lose humility before progress, if you let pride blind your mind and internal strife destroy your unity, you become vulnerable. The color red doesn't give you an automatic 1-second advantage per lap. It only imposes a sacred duty to be flawless. And being flawless under such pressure is perhaps the hardest job on the planet. This was the story of pain and greatness, the darkest hours of Ferrari on the Boosted channel. We love them when they cross the finish line first to the Italian anthem, but we only truly begin to understand the depth of this legend when we see them at the bottom. For it is in the moments of the greatest fall that the true, unbreakable character of that horse is revealed. The horse that refuses to stop, even when the whole world says that victory is no longer possible. We know that the sun over Maranello always rises again, and even after the darkest night comes a morning when the roar of the red engine once again makes rivals tremble with fear. Because Ferrari is not just racing. It is the very essence of the human drive for perfection through mistakes, falls, and eternal rebirth.